All right, y'all. I'm gonna get rolling here, especially because I'm about to waste 5 minutes of your time just kind of telling you about who I am. So we'll just get rolling, let people trickle in. So, everybody, my name is Scott Spector, and I'm here today to talk to you about accessibility, most specifically AAA compliance in the realm of WCAG or WCAG or WCAG or whatever your poison. I've heard it about 12 different ways this conference, so no judgment here, but WCAG for today. And yeah, we're going to talk about how to navigate them. We're going to talk about the science, the art of it all, and kind of everything in between. So without further ado, as promised, a little bit about myself and a vertically stretched star, because I'm bad at PowerPoint. But again, my name is Scott Spector, and just again, a little bit about me. I am the Director of Accessibility and Quality at Teody Creative, which is a full-service creative agency in the Washington, D.C. area. And a couple of quick things before I start, because I'm sure I'm going to forget the end. First and foremost, big thank you to the entire DrupalCon team. An incredible event, as always, my first one in a couple of years, in person especially. So y'all put on an amazing event. We know this stuff doesn't happen overnight by itself, so really appreciate you. And more importantly, I kind of have a funny note there at the bottom. I am not a lawyer, nor am I a doctor. And I would like to say that because a lot of what we talk about today is around neurodivergence and all types of forms of different abilities and disabilities. And of course, I just want to make sure that you all know I am not a doctor, nor have I been trained. Everything today is kind of my experience and how I've seen it, and my expert opinion throughout years and almost 15 years of experiencing accessibility. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm also going to talk a little bit about rule of law, especially in the United States. So bear with me, but always double check with your legal counsel before you take anything I say to heart, which is just a general rule in all times. And so here's just a quick view of our office again. We are in DC, and I usually kind of like to start with just kind of a quick resume, if you will. It's hard when you see someone up there you never met before. Who are they to tell me what accessibility is all about? So again, we are a full-service digital agency. We do everything at Teody, from brand work, from strategy to development and UX design. And of course, our bread and butter is Drupal development. So a lot of what we do is centered around Drupal, what Drupal can do and what we can make out of Drupal, of course, to make more accessible experiences. And also, I usually like to also mention that one of my favorite parts of these conferences is meeting people from all over the world in different walks of life. And so I've really had a great pleasure talking to a lot of you all throughout the week about accessibility and kind of how you all handle it at your agencies and in your kind of shops. So again, I'm Scott Spector. I come from Teody. I like spinach omelets, Formula One, and public speaking, which is great. So let's jump into it. AAA compliance. It is scary stuff. It is not for the faint of heart. You hear it whenever you see it, an RFP or a proposal, or your boss asks you, do you have any experience in AAA compliance? If you were anything like me the first time, I immediately left the room, threw up, came back, and then Googled what AAA compliance was. And now, cut to a dozen years later, we figured it out a little bit. We've kind of gone through some things. So my intent today is to kind of make it a little bit more approachable for you all. Kind of talk to you, again, throughout what exactly does AAA compliance mean? And what is the science of that? How do you do it as a developer? How do you do it from a technical scoping and everything before it hits the dev's hands kind of perspective? But also, how do you balance that with your design teams? And not just your visual design, but your user experience and everything kind of in between. And then I'm going to kind of show you a couple of examples of how we've executed at Teody over the last couple of years on AAA compliance. And then I'm going to do something funny, and I'm going to try and talk you out of building something that is AAA compliant. And again, these are my experiences. These are my opinions. Please take them with that grain of salt, but that is what I'm going to try and do today. And last but not least, I'm going to try and give you a holistic view of exactly how these projects work and how the intricacies are a little different from other projects you might be working on from a project and account management perspective. And also what I'm going to do is try and stay within time, but that will not work, so I didn't put it on here because I manage expectations. So first and foremost, some ground rules, and then I promise we're actually going to get into it. I want to try and keep this an open format. I appreciate you all coming. I know it's the end of the conference, and it's not easy to stick around for these last final sessions, but I always like to keep these in open format. Ask questions as I go. I've got the lights on my eyes, so I might not see you, so feel free just to shout at me. But most importantly, if you do have a question or a comment, it must begin with a compliment about Scott, myself, or I will not answer your question. Again, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a doctor. For the next 45 minutes or so, this is the safest place on earth. Accessibility is a tough subject to talk about sometimes, especially in today's climate. You try and kind of walk on eggshells a little bit about certain terminology and how you approach situations. I want you to know that whether the terminology used, disabled, differently abled, divergent, this is a safe space. We are all here to learn. If we can't do it here, especially at DrupalCon, when can we do it? So again, feel free. It's an open and safe space for the next 45 minutes or so. All right, so rooting the conversation in rules. Sorry, double audio there. So rooting the conversation in rules. WCAG is a finite set of rules, which means we can conquer it in some way, shape, or form. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we've done that from the science perspective. Again, breaking up the science and the art just a little bit here. And once we understand those rules, we can control them. And we can build experiences, and we can develop modules and contribute back to the community to kind of conquer this goal, which is, to rule WCAG, to not let it kind of dictate what you do, but, work around it within the realm that you're trying to accomplish. So let's jump into it. For those of you who are mildly or who are not, super familiar with WCAG, I kind of wanted just to do a very brief overview exactly how this all kind of works together. As it is, there's a lot of moving parts here. So first and foremost, WCAG is not the end-all be-all. It's actually, the fourth thing down from a very long line of experts that really focus on accessibility. So if you've heard of WCAG, what it starts with is W3C, which I'm sure all of us here have heard of W3C in one form or another. And underneath W3C is the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, which I'm sure maybe some of us have heard of. And then, of course, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are kind of, what we all imagine and what we all strive for when we build or design compliance systems. So how does this all kind of, loop in together? And for today, I'm going to not focus on the different levels, the 2.0, the 2.1, the 2.2, or potentially 3.0 coming out. I'm more than happy to field any questions on those, but I'm just not going to focus on them. I'm going to mostly focus on A, AA, and AAA criteria across all those today. And so for those who are, the uninitiated, the A is more or less the basics. We typically find this when devs fall into it by accident, right? They're just really great developers that their syntax is impeccable and that they can develop, within an inch and within a pixel of spec, but they weren't doing it intentionally. Typically, we find those to be, single A compliance sites, the bare minimum. AA compliance is the gold standard. That's typically, a client who knows what they're doing, someone who, has been around the block a little bit, knows AA compliance as the gold standard for a job well done. It is extremely accessible, and it really is what you need to have someone with disabilities be able to, comfortably navigate your site. And AAA, the big behemoth we are here to talk about today. And I will warn you, again, I'm going to come back to this at some point and try and talk you out of it, because even the WCAG, even the WAI initiative, does not believe AAA is possible. Again, I took this quote there at the bottom, and I'm going to read it off for those who might be seeing the recording. They say in their own criteria that it is not recommended that level AAA conformance be required as a general policy for entire sites because it is not possible to satisfy all level AAA success criteria for some content. Now think about that. Even the people that created this thing believes that it is unreachable. So we've already kind of set the stage here for what potentially is an unreachable goal here. But I promise, more to come. I'm going to hopefully alleviate some of that burden there and talk a little bit how we could do it. But again, I just want to set the stage that when you jump into these AAA compliant projects, it's not always that straightforward. And when we talk about compliance, when we talk about accessibility in general, again, for those who are well established and have worked on accessibility projects before, when you typically get feedback back in any way, shape, or form, it's in one of these four different categories. So whether you're a builder, a tester, someone in sales, you always focus typically on these four items: cognitive, auditory, physical, and visual. Cognitive, and everything there is on a spectrum, right? The science behind the spectrum has ballooned over the past decade of defining what the spectrum is in all shapes and walks of life, especially in the medical field. But when it comes to accessibility, it's extremely powerful to think of all these things as a spectrum. Again, I'm going to get back to this in a little bit. When you think of cognitive, it can be as mild as something like ADD or ADHD to something a little bit more debilitating, like PTSD or dementia or Alzheimer's. And auditory, there's two main different types of auditory or hearing disabilities, or divergence, if you will. And I'm not going to remember their names. They're very scientific, and I tried really hard before the session to remember them. But no amount of acronyms will help me figure that one out. So there's two different kinds. The kind you typically hear after a rock concert, the ringing in your ears, and the other type of auditory disabilities are typically the more dulling kind. Kind of, if you ever had swimmer's ear, or if you've stuck a Q-tip in too far, like your doctor told you not to 100 times, that is that dulled kind of hearing that users sometimes experience. And physical is the most interesting and candidly easily the hardest for me and my team to kind of usually wrap our heads around solutions for, because they're so wide and the spectrum is infinitely long for types of physical impairments. Because you also introduce a second kind of level there. It's not just physical ability to use your motor functions, like full use of your limbs, but it's also kind of dives into temporary versus permanent disabilities, right? When you think of physical ones, it's easy to think of something like a broken arm, and kind of how that affects your day to day. So it's something you need to think about, especially if you're building an emergency hospital website. You want to kind of take this kind of things into consideration. It really opens up the doors to a lot of different ways to solve problems. In visual, of course, that's probably the one that the most people in the entire world are affected by. Of course, you have things that kind of come in time, like cataracts, and you have things that partial blindness, complete blindness, or just reduced vision, just like needing glasses for kind of treatable vision, if you will. And again, I want to reemphasize the fact that all this lives on a spectrum of all different types of varieties. And I would be remiss not to mention the fact that it is good business. I'm going to spend a lot of time today pulling on your heartstrings and telling you exactly why accessibility is just the right thing to do. But if you take nothing away from this entire talk, I want to show you this slide because it's easily the most powerful one I will ever kind of create, even though I stole the data and none of it is actually original. But the important things to note here, 26% of the entire U.S. population identifies with at least one form of disability. That is 61.2 million people, which is about 42% of adults 65 and up with one or more disabilities. And then, of course, if you go two or more disabilities, that the number slowly goes down. It really isn't that as steep as you'd imagine. Most importantly, those users that we're talking about have an expendable market share of $490 billion. So for those of you who've been around and paying attention to accessibility in the past 5 years or so, there's a developer, a very talented engineer who did the math. First, he found that there was an issue on Chipotle's ordering. When you go online and you try and order a burrito off Chipotle's online website or their app, the form to check out was actually inaccessible. The engineer did what all good engineers do and over-engineered a solution to try and figure out how to fix it. Once they fixed it, he did the math, and he tried to figure out how much money they left on the table over the years. And the number was astronomical. It was in the hundreds of millions. And this is just because Chipotle, no one could check out. They couldn't finally put in their credit card number to get out. So Chipotle figured this out. They fixed it, obviously. But over the course of 5 or 6 years, when their platform was live, they lost tons of money. So again, when I talk about accessibility, I focus on why it's the right thing to do. I think everyone here can agree on that. But a lot of these times, I leave these sessions, and people always ask, how do I evangelize this internally? And this slide kind of speaks for itself. You put this in front of anybody on your board, any manager, any CEO, and you say, this is an unrealized market that we have not tapped into. Let's jump into figuring out what compliance looks like. That number is just going to scare the pigtails off anybody. So keep that number in mind. Again, this slide is extremely powerful for any project I've kind of jumped into. Finishing up the science part a little bit, I've told you about the rules. I told you about kind of the constraints, the scaffolding that we live in as we are building accessible projects. And I had a million different examples. Again, none of it original work from myself because I'm actually not the talented one. I rely on my talented developers in that row over there to actually do the smart stuff. But instead of examples, I'm just going to kind of breeze through a lightning round of some things that we typically focus on here. Using ARIA liberally and carefully. This is a gray area between my last slide and this side. ARIA is the buzzword nowadays. When you're trying to evangelize a subject internally or for a client, use the word ARIA. People get it. People understand that is what they perceive to be the standard in accessible markup. Obviously, for those of us who have been around the block a little bit, that is not entirely true. You want to lean on HTML. You want to lean on the native abilities of HTML to kind of drive accessibility for you. And ARIA is a supplement of that. ARIA is not the native tool that you should be using to build accessible experiences at the front end. Impactful and meaningful roles and labels. This was extremely important, if not just from a maintenance perspective. Creating meaningful roles and labels, making sure that the same things from a affordances standpoint are named the same things on accordions, on everything, are clear. No one wants to see an accordion that is, has a label that says ACRD 123, right? It should be called accordion. At the very most, accordion-1, accordion-2, or whatever kind of variety your teams think up. Maybe you win the lottery tomorrow. Maybe another dev has to pick this up blind. Make this clear and make this meaningful, and you'll find infinite savings across entire projects for the longevity that you're working on it. Design tabbing and reading order. I'm going to get into this a little bit, so I'm going to breeze through this one, but make sure that tabbing and reading order is a UX project that's also in the dev perspective. You want to make sure that while you're figuring out top to bottom, left to right, how's that going to work? Make sure your dev's in the room. Make sure there's a UX person in there as well. Basic informational tables. Every piece of user testing I've ever done with users with disabilities, they've always said just, when in doubt, put it in a table. Tables are the only thing that's really scaled with accessibility over the course of the web. Obviously, if you over-engineer a table, if you kind of try and create something custom, it's going to get a little bit hairy, going to get a little bit dicey. But obviously, we all love our CK editor. We all love the table tools that are allowed in it. Just use that when in doubt. It's a great way for assistive tech to kind of parse through content. Focus on multimedia. AA and AAA. If you ever Google what is the difference between AA and AAA, every site you find will say AA and AAA, the only difference is this multimedia kind of component of it. Pre-recorded captions, making sure that there's an alternative transcript for any type of media, any type of video that goes on your site, and that is extremely difficult. What we found is that when you focus on that from the beginning, and especially from the dev stage, kind of moving that up in the line of your discovery process, when you focus on multimedia, everything kind of falls in around it. Once you kind of go down the road of having to figure out how are you going to create captions, how are you going to create live media that still has some kind of sign language interpreter content, it really starts to bring to life this user-focused model that I'm going to go over in a bit. User experience and development I already touched on. Accessibility tools, I'm actually going to show you a cool example of that in a second. But if you've ever been to the new White House website, those bottom left side, the contrast tool, the sharing links, all those things are built in the website. I'm not talking about overlays. I am smart enough to not do that on a stage. But building them in natively is acceptable and actually a component of AAA compliance that you could fail if you don't do yourself. This is an interesting one, and I'm not going to get into it too much now, but it is it's tough. There's a lot of different opinions on the matter. People love their own assistive technology. They want to use that to modify the environment around them digitally, but some people like the tools built in. And candidly, again, this kind of just goes back to your client, who you're building it for, the people you're building it for, and the types of disabilities they may or may not have. Don't forget about Zoom. Making sure your website works at 400% Zoom is no easy task. I do not envy you developers who have to try and figure that out. Luckily, I'm not the person who has to do that. Again, it's those guys who are much smarter than me. And most importantly, arrange for help when applicable. User testing. Anytime you read any article on the site about how to build accessible experiences, they say you must test with people that have the forms of disabilities you're trying to account for, which is kind of a no-brainer, but I wanted to mention that here as it is, it's an extremely important part of the entire AAA build process. And as a developer, it's hard to sometimes remember that, right? You reach an end of a project, you're waiting for your project manager to tell you what's next. But try and evangelize that within your team, right? And this is more of a qualitative component of AAA compliance, just as much as quantitative. So when you are building, you reach the end, you realize, the things are good, but you need to figure out and make sure to confirm that with the people, just like you would normal user testing. So work with your project managers, your account managers, your entire team, and find a way to get people with disabilities to actually use your content. It is extremely eye-opening. There's just stuff you'll never think of until you actually see someone try and navigate it with assistive tech. So now I've talked a little bit about the science. I'm going to talk about the art and before I talk about how they all kind of come together. Because the art is extremely important. And it is easily, especially as a developer, the hardest part to kind of get buy-in to, right? Sorry, notes. I haven't done one of these live in a long time. Alrighty, so the art of the matter here. Accessible design planning is extremely important. And I'm only going to breeze over the design part, but I do want to mention that it is probably one of the hardest things to ask a designer to do, to meet AAA contrast criteria and still make something beautiful. We did a decent job on it a couple of times, but for the most part, again, AAA compliance with all the rules that conflict with each other make it really hard to build something that is not just black and white, right? And to go into your creative meetings and talk about how, sorry, this doesn't pass AAA compliance, try something a little darker, try something a little lighter. So how do we conquer that? Accessibility TOD has been a long unlearned path, but with the support of the team, we've really come a long way. And here are just some quick takeaways from that. Evangelizing accessibility is a team sport. I have had the unpleasant responsibility at TOD over the many, many years and time before that as being the person who comes to the room and says those things. Sorry, this contrast doesn't work. This logical reading order isn't there. When I bring this up on my iPhone and zoom into 400%, all I see is white, and I can't even do anything else. So evangelizing it internally, putting someone in charge of it, making it just as important as anything else, the CTAs or any type of other affordance. Kind of working that into the process at the beginning is extremely important. And of course, what goes along with that is practicing that active listening and relentless empathy. It is, for lack of a better way to say it, a little frustrating. And again, I'm hoping you guys return the favor and letting me be a little honest here. It's extremely frustrating trying to comply with the AAA compliant level in design. And it's not something anyone has an opinion on. Again, it's this scaffolding. It's this rule book that we're forced to kind of operate on every once in a while. So trying just to kind of see where the designers are coming from, trying to figure out what the devs' hurdles are so you can help conquer them together is extremely important. And let the data light the path. I should have put this one on top because easily the most important one. AAA compliance. Again, circling back to one of those first slides, it is extremely important for very specific sets of sites. Again, an Alzheimer's research site that really you want to focus on that cognitive disability a lot. Some kind of motor impairment organization, does advocacy for groups that are affected by it. You want to do research first. So I was recently speaking at a conference, and a man who owns a group of religious temples in the DC area asked, Scott, how do I get this thing moving? I got a board who's strapped for cash as it is, and I can't find a way to convince them to build an accessible experience, to build an accessible website, to build accessible schedules for temple gatherings and such. And no matter what I do, I can't convince them to do it. So the easiest answer I gave was just, figure out the data, pull your demographics. Temples for me are the more straightforward ones, and because the population is typically a little older, right? The community at those are typically the older generation, it's 50 and up. So going back, I'm not going to go back because I'm sure I'm going to mess it up. But going back to that business case slide, right? I can show my boss, I can show the CEO of the temple that 50% of our entire congregation has a need for this. 50% of them can't even look at the schedules. They just call up ahead. They bother someone at the front desk every single time they want to see it. That's not right? And not only that, but if we make our digital experience more welcoming, that we can kind of dive into that audience. We can collect more people for our community, and you want to engage those users. You want more. You want more buy-in. And the funny part is typically what I found in these user testing is when people with disabilities have trouble accessing a site, they'll just move on, right? There's no recourse for them. What are you going to do? Sue everybody you can't get through? Actually, some people do. I'm not going to talk about that. But, it's really frustrating. So if you create a digital ecosystem that people can access, especially at something like Temple, where the users are all very easy to kind of pinpoint and know exactly what they need, focus on that data. Focus on how long they stay there. Focus on their age. Focus on how old their kids are, because that's typically how that user flow works. So again, let the data light the path. Start with data and work your way back is the easiest way I can talk about design planning. And creating a backlog of features or elements of note. I want to mention this, I should have said probably kitchen sink, right? Once you create accessible components, especially AAA accessible components, you want to kind of store those somewhere, right? I've been to a couple sessions today about, not today, over the conference, about, repeatable libraries, design components like that. Create it, save it, move it to the side so that when you go do your next build, just like we all do on every dev build, you have that component. You don't have to spend as much time rebuilding it. I know that kind of sounds a little simplified, but that is very true with accessibility more so than most. Every dot, every pixel, every CTA, make sure you save it so you don't have to spend as much time there. And then you can focus on where you'll drive the most value on the dev side, recreating accordions that might not be totally compliant. Or again, focusing on specific user types. And again, start small. Think of components and work your way out. If you're one of the people that like to build puzzles from the outside, build the edges first, you're going to be mad at me for saying this, but do your best at working small and then building yourself out. And executing the plan, these are in AAA criteria. Again, I'm focusing on mostly the difference between what's different between AA and AAA. These are the areas you need to pay the most attention to. Typography. I think actually Comic Sans might be accessible, but I'd recommend against it. But there's a lot of fonts, that are really bold, that are really tight together, that are inaccessible. For people with dyslexia or people with visual impairment that cannot, kind of make sense of these fonts that are just really beautiful to look at sometimes. But for people with certain that are, divergent in some sense, it's really difficult. So focus on typography. Contrast is more of a formula, so I won't spend much time on that. But make sure you kind of account for the newer, upgraded level of conformance they're going to ask you to meet for contrast. Menus are extremely important. I went to an incredible session yesterday about the new front-end theme and how they're trying to make the Drupal experience, the menus, a lot more accessible. And menus are a big part of AAA compliance. So review those as you are designing and, of course, building. Tables already talked about, beautiful, don't deviate too much. It's classic, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of scenario. Maps, don't bother. Call Esri if you can. Get out of that project as soon as you can. Maps are incredibly difficult to make accessible. They are the big unicorn of the dev and design world and how to make an accessible map. is truly difficult. And candidly, I've only seen about 1 or 2 that I've really, really loved. So when it comes to maps, I typically, candidly, try and find a kind of separate solution, find an alternative way to navigate a map or digest that content that is in that map. And motion animation is the most important one. I say this because in all of our user testing, motion is the hardest thing for someone with almost every disability across this 4 I showed you, anywhere on the spectrum, to really figure out. If you do not provide a pause button, especially if you have animating graphics that are kind of in your face when you jump on the page, it is really tough. It can sometimes, through some of our work with arts foundations in the DC area for veterans, we found and we've gotten feedback that this wasn't too jarring, but I've seen something like it that has induced a PTSD episode from any form of whether they're in the military, whether they had other forms of cognitive issues that they were trying to work through. Motion. Think of spinning globes. Think of beautiful graphics glowing down the page. For those of us who are lucky enough that we do not fall into that category of that potentially triggering something, it looks beautiful. But for almost everyone else, it's really tough, and it has serious consequences. So when you execute this plan and you combine the science of the art, think about stuff like that. And again, as much as you can, get real users testing in there. Now, a really quick case study, and I'm looking at time, and I'm running a little hot, so I'm going to try and fly through this a little bit. This is an example of a AAA compliant site that Toyota has recently built. I removed the client logo because it is still in its beta phase that we are hoping to launch soon. And as soon as it does, I promise I will post it on my LinkedIn for the world to see. So if you don't follow me yet on LinkedIn, connect with me. I'd love to chat. But also, I promise I'll push this out when I can. And I love this site because it is probably one of the ones I'm most proud of, that we found a way to combine the most beautiful art that we can with the science that is AAA compliance. And I'm more than happy to take any hecklers that want to try and poke holes in it, in which case I will absolutely shovel the question over to Bree over there to answer smart for me. But at the same time, this is just beautiful design and beautiful science at play here. And at the bottom left there, you can see what I was talking about before, those native tools built into your website. The share button, the contrast, and the text size. That is a genuine AAA compliance goal that you have to meet in order to be AAA compliant. But and they're really great, but again, they're a little controversial, just like overlays, right? People want to use the tools that they are comfortable using, like JAWS, like NVIDIA, like any other browser extension they use to kind of tackle the web, if they will. So when they're approached with these types of tools, it's sometimes confusing. It sometimes actually confuses the software. So pay attention to that, but again, talk to your users. Do not assume that AAA compliance and creating one of these is exactly what you need to do, because users first, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But again, just a couple other humble brags about this beautiful site that we built. All right, I'm done, I promise. And now I'm going to try and talk you out of AAA compliance. Totally flipping the bill on y'all. So why? For anybody who's ever taken on a AAA compliant website, I challenge you to say the first thing is why. Obviously, don't be too skeptical. Have a conversation with them. Ask them why. Sometimes it is a very valid criteria to meet, right? I focus mostly on medicine because that's a lot of where AAA compliance comes into play. For people that need it, again, very specific user groups of elderly people, of blind people, of associations for people, again, like the ones I just mentioned, that have PTSD primarily. Evaluate why. Always ask questions, but of course, hear why first. And this is one of my favorite ways to kind of tell this story. And this is how, and again, this is one of my favorite examples. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from it for clients. So feel free to steal it. The easiest way to kind of talk clients out of their own way, right? To make them start thinking about the user and not just some board member who said, crap, all of our competitors are getting sued. We need to make this thing as compliant as humanly possible. I went on Google, I found AAA compliance, and that's the most successful thing out there, so we are going to make a AAA compliant website. Wrong, Mr. and Mrs. Chairman. I think there's a different way to go about it. So I like to kind of root the conversation in the physical realm, because again, that makes things a little easier to comprehend. Now, the year is 1989. I walk up to my front door, and I see a doorknob. The doorknob, I've got arms full of groceries, right? Arms full of groceries, I get to the front door, and I see a doorknob. And I try and, jiggle it with my knee a little bit, and I kick it down, and eventually I'm sweating, and I finally get in the door eventually with some, tricky elbow work. Drop a bag of eggs, I get yelled at by my partner, whatever, all is well as end well. Same situation, now a door handle is in front of you. You walk up to the front door, arms full of groceries, you are easily able to kind of jimmy that open with your elbow. Within 2 seconds, you're in the door. No eggs were harmed in the making of this talk. Now, this is a very human and easy way to kind of digest what this what accessibility work is, right? In 1990, the ADA actually outlawed the doorknob because it is not an accessible solution. Again, I just gave the example of groceries because that's one we can all understand. But after the ADA outlawed doorknobs, you'll never walk into a new build and see doorknobs. You'll see door handles because they are objectively just the better design. They're better for everybody. So that is exactly what we try and tell our clients when we start the conversation about AAA compliance. We root the things in what actually matters, in universal design, and in focusing that on situations that matter, not just a compliance thing that I saw on Google. Now, putting the user first. I'm full disclosure, I stole this slide a little bit from one of my good friends, Gareth Ford Williams, who worked at the BBC for a while and developed their accessibility program. But this is something that really resonated with me when I talked with him a couple of months ago. And in the UK, candidly, their accessibility programs are much less focused on the legal system. In America, unfortunately, almost all of our accessibility work kind of revolves around who has been sued for what. What have they not been sued for yet? How can we find ways in for malicious litigation from those law firms in New York just going after people? But he had a really interesting view on it. And this is, again, a really great component to kind of verbalize a subject with your clients. Building websites and building designs is not about compliance. We don't call it compliance experience design. We also don't call it legal experience design. Imagine trying to go into a pitch and saying, we've got the best legal experience design team in the world. Step right up, we're going to do great. You're not going to win that bid. I don't care how cheap you are, you're not going to win that bid. It's human experience design. That is why we are here. So as soon as you can get them to agree that we're all here to build the best site for the best group of users and focus on human experience design, you kind of won the conversation already. You've got your foot in the door. You're having a conversation about humans and the people that use your website. So once you've done that, you've kind of moved the conversation away from a potentially arbitrary group of guidelines into, let's build this for the people that are going to use it. And this one is actually also extremely powerful and mostly applicable to the dev side, and that, we as devs are control of, candidly, disability. I know that sounds a little dramatic, but the social model for disabilities are that your impairment plus your environment equals your disability, right? If there's the great accessibility memes out there where, it's a town full of all short people, and that's just how the town has been for hundreds of years. And then one tall person comes in the town, and he says, this town isn't built for people with disabilities, right? It's the same conversation, just in reverse, right? The environment itself was not accessible. We, as web creators, web developers, web designers, have a responsibility to create an environment that is accessible for all, no matter what or who they are or how they navigate the web. So if you focus on creating that environment, you at least take that part of the equation, and you can make things accessible for all. And now, this is also kind of just an add-on to one of the business slides I showed earlier, but I think it's really important. And again, I want to focus on this idea of human-centered design and user-centered design, and not necessarily this mode of compliance. But this also kind of skirts both of these. So in this chart, you can see, and just reading out for the recording here, on the left is text that says, the number of people worldwide aged 80 and over will quadruple to 400 million by 2050. So for the first time in history, there will be more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 14. So we are slowly, but very surely, inching towards a world where more people have disabilities than do not when they try and use the web. Now, can you imagine that as a different business case slide, right? How do you ignore this? As a business development person, as someone in charge of your finances, you're growing your team and building stuff, you want to build it for the most people. How could you possibly rationalize building more focused on the 14 and under crowd, more than the 65 and before you know it, you've got a target on accessibility. You have a more refined set of requirements from both AA and AAA. And now we finally worked our way out of AAA compliance and back to a more human-centered approach. And I'm reaching the end here. I'm going to try and leave a little time for questions if I can. But one of the other things that I find the most powerful, and this is candidly a little agnostic of what compliance level you're shooting for, is this idea of training and workshops and creating this safe space. Again, that element that I tried to introduce at the very beginning of this conversation about creating a safe space. I promise you, there's nobody more uncomfortable in these conversations than your clients or people that have never heard of accessibility before. What I like to do, and again, this might not be the most popular opinion, is kind of make accessibility fun. Make the idea of learning about accessibility a enjoyable activity. So much of accessibility is people like me standing up on stages, telling you're a terrible person if you don't build accessible websites, or if you do not design accessible content, or print material, or anything in between. But what I really like to do is take the walls down, right? Trying to figure out, have a workshop with people. You can see on the bottom left here these couple of different slides about how we kind of work our way into the conversation. Color contrast. Pull up a slide of some ridiculous color contrast, a bright yellow on a white, and say, which one is compliant, which one is not, and work your way to some harder stuff. Talk about alt text. And this cognitive disability one I actually really love, because it really introduces this idea of neurodivergence, which is arguably just the hardest one to build around. So in this elephant, this is a common psychological image, if you will, where at the bottom you can't tell how many feet that this elephant has. It's an optical illusion. Now take that and step back a little bit. This is a pure and perfect example of how someone who might have just suffered traumatic brain injury. Again, I'm going to focus a little bit on the hospital just because it's the easiest example to talk through. But someone who just had some kind of traumatic brain injury now has to rewire their brain. They don't always see things perfectly. They see the stuff like this as much like patients with dyslexia or people who are just getting introduced to the concept have trouble kind of trying to really fine-tune what they're looking at. And so this is a great example of how that works. And my favorite is this kind of screenshot of this Zoom, which I absolutely did not get their permission to put up on the screen here, is a really fun activity I do with some of these clients. And this is a very common activity. You can find it online. And again, if you reach out, I'm more than happy to provide you the link. This basically, it's a program that inverts your mouse. So you have to try and trace the mouse, and you have to try and trace the star with your mouse inverted. So everything left, you move your mouse left, the mouse goes right. Mouse up, it goes down. And if you're Nick Wild, you will cheat and invert your mouse settings and your preferences. Just kidding, Nick. Didn't mean to call you out. Just kidding, I did. Still hate you for it. But this is really fun. You can see we're laughing at each other. You can see that we're having a great time kind of learning about the subject of accessibility. We are in this meeting. We are trying to figure out exactly the best conformance level to meet for this client. We're talking about the different areas of the site. We're kind of trying to put ourselves in the shoes of people with disabilities and how they navigate the web. And candidly, it's a tough, again, this is a safe space. It's a tough subject to laugh about, right? And I do not mean to not take the subject seriously. Obviously, this is a subject that demands the attention it deserves. But at the same time, people react and people, empathize with the time they laughed more. They definitely don't remember the slide I had two slides ago. I don't even remember the slide I had 2 times ago. But they do remember the time they laughed with their entire team, made fun of themselves, and kind of learn what people are like and how people with disabilities navigate the web. So again, there's all different types of ways to do this. I chose this one because it's just the easiest one to kind of laugh at each other at. But something like this, creating that safe space to work with your clients. Otherwise, they're just going to start barking at you, saying things like, we need AAA compliance, we need AA compliance. Do you really? Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. I'm going to laugh at you for a bit. It's going to be great. All right, and kind of bringing everything together here from a top-down approach. I really like just talking for 2 seconds about project and account management, because what is development if not supported by an entire team? What is creative if not supported by a team? So as a project manager, and again, just to be aware of, developing perfect requirements for an unobtainable goal. This is important to kind of say from the beginning, especially if you really are trying to focus on AAA compliance. Making sure that your team knows that this is a safe space. It's going to be a tough one, but we're all going to fail a couple of times before we get this right, because even the system itself is a little broken. Dig into realities, not ambitions. Again, everything I just said for the past 10 minutes is kind of going towards that goal, making sure that you are talking about the reality of the situation. If you are a Fortune 500 company, you probably do not need a AAA compliant homepage that, just to have it, right? There's areas where you can make sure are AAA compliant, the areas that drive the most value for that certain user segment, but you don't need full AAA compliance. Again, I'm more than happy to go toe-to-toe with anyone who disagrees, and again, I will shove them over to Nick because he's better at arguing than I am. But in any case, put focus on where you can go all in and where you should go hold back. Again, just that idea of focusing where you need to. Don't forget the rest of your audiences. Again, a little controversial, but one of the hardest things to do when you're building accessible experiences is remember that you are not just building for people with disabilities. There's still 98% of the people in the world that want to enjoy themselves on their site. It's not to say you should ignore the 2%. It's not to say you should demote them in any way in their principle of enjoying the experience. Everyone has a right to that. That's kind of what the legislative system in its soul was built off of, even though in practice, unfortunately, it hasn't really unfolded that way over the past couple of years. And most importantly, introduce a bit of a new type of spectrum. And if I challenge you all with anything today, and I say this because I totally haven't figured it out yet, is to try and figure out how this spectrum will work for us as digital creators. And in my initial slide, when I talked about the considerations, you saw a straight linear path there with arrows on both ends, kind of going, mild to moderate to severe types of disabilities. That's not reality. That is not, and very few people, again, not very few, pardon me. Most people, when they have a disability, they will have more than one disability. They will have ADD, but maybe they also have a physical impairment. Maybe they have severe, kind of crippling and debilitating depression and also have something else. All these things are linked together more than you know. So how could you possibly measure it on a linear scale? You can't. You have to kind of figure out where all these pieces meet. And again, I like the color wheel, just the easiest way to describe it. Many different colors, many different angles coming together to a central point. And where they meet, so along the way, is kind of where you need to build. So again, it's just this idea of user-centered design and not just something on a straight scale to appease some board members. Talk about it a lot. Every single talk I've been to this week about accessibility, the idea of early and often comes up in all of them. So again, talk about it as much as humanly possible. And from an account management standpoint, one of the most fun things I've had the pleasure of doing at Toyota the past couple of years is really getting clients involved in this. And this isn't just with their website and saying, Scott, go get your Drupal team to go build us an accessible website. We get to branch out a little bit, and again, we're very spoiled that we have our marketing and all of our communications division under one roof, but we've had a lot of fun with clients that really just want to be industry leaders. If you're going to spend all the money to be AAA compliant, you might as well really get that ROI, and what better way to do that than to push it forward in every single thing you do. In your marketing advertisements, make sure that someone with a wheelchair just as much as everybody else. Audit your own work and make sure that you are accounting for all people. Everything from any DI initiative you can think of in your work as an account manager. Talk about in your quarterly check-ins. Keep an eye on the legal precedents. I, at least once a month, try and read through the big court cases coming through the system. Because unfortunately, again, the reality of the situation right now is that we are a little reactive in America. We have to kind of, the requirements come after, unfortunately, some big lawsuit, like the Target one, or Beyonce, the Queen. How can you possibly sue Beyonce? So, again, early and often, and try not to focus on their legal exposure, but make sure you prepare them for it. A really quick way to lose a client is to pretend like there's no legal world out there, that, especially if they're in Florida or California, where the most cases kind of come through, to not mention it. They're just going to think you don't have the stuff. But prepare them for it. Again, focus on the users, focus on human-centered design, but do not forget that they have real business needs as well, and you should account for them. So, as I'm wrapping up here, if you take nothing else from this session, start with the why. Don't aim for AAA compliance just for the sake of it. Know your goals, craft a strategy to support them. Celebrate the beauty of it. And again, this kind of goes back to evangelizing the subject from a design and a UX team. But some designers truly do struggle to reconcile aesthetic preferences with the constraints of an equitable web. Good designers know that accessible design is beautiful design. Going back to that doorknob door handle example. Going back to even the site I showed you earlier. It's a beautiful site. Whether it was AAA compliant, AA or single A compliant, that's just a beautiful site. And why can't that just be the way the whole internet works, right? And also think beyond the web. Again, going back to your project and account considerations, it's very rarely, if ever, just about your website. It's about everything. It's about the newsletter you send out. It's about your monthly announcements being in a PDF that nobody can actually open or have any accessible content in. I'm not going to talk about PDFs. I promised everybody I wouldn't. But rooting your brand and that trust and that equity. Again, going back to that example where people will just leave your site if it's not accessible, right? Making everything accessible tells people that this is a safe place to come if you have some kind of divergence and you need a more accessibility markup to navigate the web. And this sounds a little silly, but there's a huge community out there. If you have a disability, you will reach out to your community members, your peers, your colleagues, and say, this website is especially accessible. It's not just, it doesn't just meet those core principles, perceivable, operable, understandable, and readable. Robust. But it also has something else. It has an E at the end, and that E is for enjoyable. Enjoyable is a real quantifiable statistic on every website you make. So make sure you account for that, and you talk about that in your brand. You lean into it. Again, candidly speaking, none of this stuff is all that cheap, right? And if you're building a AAA site, you want to make sure you get the most ROI on it. So Don't just think of it as a website. Think about everything in between. Even the communications you put out, make sure it's clear language and plain language so that anyone can understand it. And last but certainly not least, establish a culture. Make it just as accessible, make it just as important about logging your time at the end of the day. Sorry, I hate logging my time. I don't want to talk about it. Make it as important as logging your time at the end of the day. Make it a spot on all of your job ads. Make it a specialization, but also preach the idea. I always say, I want you guys to work me out of the job. Get so good at accessibility that there's no longer one point person, Scott Spector, Director of Accessibility. We're just a team that all is incredible accessibility specialists. So if you see that culture, it's not going to happen overnight, but over the course of a year, maybe even a little less, you'll find everyone's kind of really rallied around it and has their own acumen in accessibility, building and designing. And that is it, folks. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you joining me again, especially in the afternoon session on the last day of DrupalCon. So before I end, any questions? I got about 2 minutes. All right, awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and have a great rest of your week.